No one knew why that hospital window had marks on the glass. They looked like scratches. But when the sun hit it in the late afternoon, you could read them, as if someone had written with their soul instead of their hands. It was there, almost invisible, but undeniably present, as if the room had a memory, as if that space had seen too much. The number on the door was 312, one of the quietest rooms in the hospital, tucked away at the end of a forgotten hallway. And maybe because of that, few knew the truth. Two men had laid in that bed at different times, but both were touched by the same message. A message left behind by someone who no longer breathed, but whose faith still echoed through the walls. The first man's name was Elliot. The second, Brian. They never met, never heard each other's voice, never shook hands. Yet the life of one became the miracle of the other. And it all began with a psalm, a simple passage from the Bible, handwritten, hidden, forgotten, or maybe saved by God for just the right moment. This story isn't about death. It's about what remains afterward, about what continues even when the heartbeat stops, about how words soaked in faith can travel through time, reach someone on the edge of giving up, and turn surrender into redemption. Do you believe that something written in silence can shout inside another soul years later? Then stay with me until the end, because today, you're going to witness the power of what happens when one man's dying faith becomes the hope of another about to give up on life. And more than that, you'll understand why that psalm was kept, just for you. If something has already touched your heart, click the like button as an act of faith. And now, write in the comments the name of the person you want to see restored. Share your story, even if it's short, because every name becomes a whisper before God. Every testimony turns this video into an altar, and every line you write could be the beginning of someone's healing. Brian didn't know it yet, but what he was about to find in that room would be much more than a note. It would be the echo of a life that refused to die in silence. His name was Elliot Barnes, 68 years old, with a serene gaze and a voice the nurses described as too calm for someone who's dying. He had been in the hospital for almost 3 weeks before being moved to room 312. His file read, metastatic cancer, prognosis, uncertain. But anyone who spoke to Elliot would never have guessed. He didn't seem to be waiting for death. He just seemed to be waiting for someone. He spent his days staring out the window, even though the view wasn't beautiful. This part of the hospital catches the afternoon sun, he'd say. That's when the soul hears best. The staff chuckled, not quite understanding. But they respected it. Elliot rarely spoke of pain. He spoke of faith and of what comes next. No one really knows when he started writing. The first note appeared taped to the wall. If you're reading this, there's still time. The next day, another. Pain only screams when the soul stays silent. They were like farewell letters, but with no recipient, just words released, to the wind or to eternity. One day, Nurse Hannah asked if he was leaving letters for his family. Elliot replied, "No, these are for whoever comes next. I don't know who that is, but God does." Hannah swallowed hard. She'd never heard a response so direct and so unexplainable. The days passed, and the writings multiplied. In the margins of the Bible beside his bed, Elliot circled verses with a blue pen and marked dates. But there was one he never showed anyone, one he kept folded inside his pillowcase. That was his secret, he said, a text he'd only hand over at the right time. In the early hours of September 28th, Elliot woke up sweating. He called for. The nurse asked for a glass of water and a sheet of paper. He wanted to write once more. His handwriting was no longer strong, but he tried, and in the corner of the page, he scribbled something that looked more like a prayer cut short than a verse. Then he looked toward the window and whispered, "Whoever you are, don't give up. There's still time." It was the last thing Elliot ever wrote. The next morning when Hannah entered the room, His eyes were closed, hands resting over his chest, with a slight smile on his lips. There was no pain in his expression, only peace. No alarms, no rush, just silence. A different kind of silence, the kind that feels like someone left after finishing a conversation, maybe with God, or maybe with the next person meant to lie in that bed. After the medical protocols were done, Elliot's belongings were packed in a box. But the note, the small, folded, nearly invisible one, went unnoticed. It had slipped between the wall and the nightstand. None of the nurses saw it. No family came to retrieve his things. Life moved on. The room was cleaned, the walls scrubbed, but the paper remained. And that's when something began that no one could have predicted. A conversation between two strangers, separated by death, but connected by faith. What Elliot didn't know, or maybe he did, was that his final gesture had not been in vain. That crumpled page, written by trembling hands, still carried life. It still pulsed. It still spoke, like a seed planted at the edge of the abyss, waiting for someone brave enough to water it. Because sometimes, the most powerful words are the ones no one ever heard out loud. And it was exactly that kind of word that weeks later would find a new heart, broken, but still able to hear. His name was Brian Walker. He was 51 years old, with a face far too tired for his age. When he was admitted to the hospital, the test results revealed something the doctors hadn't expected: a widespread infection already compromising his kidneys, liver, and heart. His body seemed to have given up. But for Brian, the giving up had started long before. He was a former traveling preacher. He had spent years crossing cities with his wife Lillian, sharing the word with anyone who would listen. Until an accident the previous year took Lillian away, and along with her, Brian's faith. Since then, he had become a quiet man, withdrawn, a ghost inside his own skin. When he entered room 312, he didn't ask questions. He didn't comment on the window view. He didn't care about schedules. He just lay down, turned to the wall, and stayed there. The doctors said he would need full rest and continuous care. He didn't respond. He just nodded. The hospital staff, used to all kinds of patients, quickly understood. Brian wasn't afraid of dying. He was simply too tired to keep living. Megan, the night shift nurse, tried to spark conversation a few times. She offered coffee, asked if he'd like music, something to read. He refused everything. When she mentioned that a chaplain was available for visits, Brian cut her off with a dry tone. "I don't need anyone else telling me that God has a plan." Megan stepped back gently. She knew it wasn't the time to push. But something inside her sensed that man wasn't just made of grief. He was made of longing too. On the third night, Brian got up from bed with difficulty. He felt a strange discomfort from the light coming through the window. He drew the curtains closed, but something stopped him. At the bottom of the glass, a strip of sunset light hit a duller patch, as if something had been etched there. He stepped closer, squinted his eyes, and saw almost erased letters. He rubbed the glass, trying to clear it, but the inscription was carved into the surface. It was a simple phrase: "He who dwells." Nothing more. Nothing less. And for some reason he couldn't explain. It made him tremble. He sat on the edge of the bed. Was that a coincidence? A leftover from another patient? Or a cruel reminder of everything he had lost? For years, Brian had used that very phrase to begin his sermons: "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High." But now, it didn't make sense anymore. Not in that place, not with his body shutting down, not without Lillian. Still, he couldn't stop looking. The next morning, Megan returned and found Brian silent, staring at the glass. He didn't say anything. But that day, for the first time, he accepted a cup of coffee. Later, he asked for paper and a pen but didn't explain why. Megan handed it to him and left. When she returned, the paper was blank, except for one name at the top: Lillian. Nothing more. But that alone was a sign, a new sound in what had once been an unbreakable silence. And there in that room where time seemed frozen, Brian began to feel the weight of something he couldn't name. It wasn't pain. It wasn't grief. It was like being watched by someone who had been there before, as if every wall in that place had seen too much and was still waiting, because sometimes the heart that resists the most is the one that most needs to be touched. And Brian was about to be touched by something that came from where he least expected, a forgotten piece of paper that still carried the faith of someone who refused to die in silence. 2 days after that first encounter with the carved phrase, Brian woke up with a strange tightness in his chest. It wasn't pain. It was a quiet discomfort, like a part of him trying to remember something he'd never lived. The room felt different, less cold, as if someone had entered and left without making a sound. He lay still for a while, staring at the ceiling, before deciding to get up and look for something. He didn't know what, but he sensed there was something hidden in that room, something left for him even if no one had said so. He started with the drawers, nothing but a disposable cup, a hospital Bible, and a sealed tissue pack. Then he ran his hand behind the nightstand and felt something stuck between the wood and the wall. It was a folded sheet, old, yellowed, nearly invisible, but still legible. Brian carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, but strong. The phrases were short, but heavy, and in the center of the page, between 2 ink-splotched scratches from a failing pen, it read, "If I'm not here tomorrow, know this, God still will be." He paused. His stomach tightened. For a moment, he didn't know if it was real. But the words burned too deeply to be just ink on paper. Beneath the phrase was a partially written psalm, and right after, a prayer line. But the prayer stopped abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. "Lord, if this pain won't go away, then use it to," and nothing more. Brian held the page for a long time. He looked at it the way one stares into an old mirror. He felt like he knew that pain, that hesitant faith, that interrupted plea. It was as if he had written it himself, in another lifetime. He took a deep breath, read every line again, and then, for the first time since the accident, he closed his eyes and whispered something that sounded like a prayer. It wasn't a beautiful prayer, or strong. It was hoarse, honest, wounded. But it was a prayer. Megan walked into the room at that very moment. She stopped at the door, saw him kneeling by the bed, head bowed, the paper in his hands. She said nothing, just honored the moment. After a few minutes, he stood up, wiped his eyes, and said, "This wasn't written for just anyone. It was written for me." She stepped closer, read the note in silence, and then replied softly, "Maybe God let you find it on the exact day you needed to." That night felt different. Brian slept deeply, and when he woke up, he felt like someone had passed through the room during the night. Not physically, but spiritually. It was a strange sensation, comforting and unsettling at the same time, like he had been visited by a memory that wasn't his. Like that note, written by a stranger, had somehow translated everything he had never been able to say, and maybe that's exactly what the paper carried, words he had never dared to speak, but now found himself saying, even without realizing it. As he folded the note and placed it back inside the nightstand drawer, Brian felt something shift inside him. It wasn't full-blown faith, not yet, but it was an echo, a first step. And, as strange as it seemed, he no longer felt completely alone in that room. Not anymore. Because sometimes, the most important notes are the ones left unfinished. Because the rest is meant to be written by the one who finds them. And Brian still had something to write. The next morning, Brian woke before sunrise. He sat on the bed, and for the first time since his admission, wasn't afraid to open the curtains. The sky was still dark, but a faint line of light stretched across the horizon. And there, With his eyes fixed on the place where night slowly gave way to day, he opened the note once more. He read every word with reverence, not as if it were an old scrap of paper, but as if it were a personal letter addressed to him. It was the only thing in that room that made sense. That sentence. "If I'm not here tomorrow, know this. God still will be," was all he needed to hear, even if he couldn't fully explain why. Day by day, Brian began speaking more with Megan. He was still a man of few words, but something in him had changed. When she entered the room, he no longer turned his face away. He began to accept small things: a silent prayer, a hymn played quietly on a phone, a brief visit from the chaplain. Not to talk, just to listen. As if he were trying to absorb a truth lost somewhere in the silence. It was during one of these conversations that he asked, "Do you remember who was in this room before me?" She hesitated, then nodded. Yes. An older gentleman named Elliot. Terminal cancer. He wasn't here long, but he left a lot behind. Brian frowned. "He wrote this?" he asked, holding up the note. Megan recognized it immediately. She touched the paper gently, as if it were sacred. "Yes, he wrote often. He said it wasn't for him. It was for whoever came next." Brian said nothing, but something inside him stirred. He got out of bed with effort, grabbed a sheet of notebook paper, and began to write. His handwriting was shaky, like Elliot's, but his eyes were steady. At the top of the page he wrote, "I answered your prayer." Below that, he finished the unfinished line, "Lord, if this pain won't go away, then use it to turn me into someone else's miracle." When he finished, he took a deep breath. Megan stood quietly nearby. Then he said, "I don't know if God healed me, but I know he woke me up." And in that moment, something happened in the room. It wasn't visible, it wasn't audible, but it was real. A kind of peace that doesn't come from medicine, a presence that doesn't ask for explanations. And when Brian placed the new note beside the old one, in the same empty drawer space, he understood something. This wasn't a message passed between two patients. It was a conversation between two sons, one who was leaving and one who was coming home. Days later, the doctors noticed something unusual. The inflammation markers had started to go down. Brian's body, which until then had resisted antibiotics, began to respond. His liver stabilized. His kidneys, once considered compromised, began functioning again with minimal support. They couldn't explain it, but Brian could. He didn't call it a miracle. He called it an answer. On the last night of that hospital stay, Brian sat at the small table near the window. He wrote another letter. This time, not to Elliot, but to whoever would come next. He folded it carefully, tucked it inside the pages of the Bible, and before lying down, he prayed softly, "God, if my faith survived the pain, then let it heal someone else too." Because sometimes faith doesn't die with the one who leaves. It crosses time. It lives. In words, it echoes through walls and turns quiet hospital rooms into invisible temples. And that's what room 312 had become, a hidden altar. And Brian was one step away from discovering which psalm held up that altar. Brian was never one to ask questions. But that morning, as he folded his blanket and tidied the papers in the drawer with his hands, he felt something was still missing. He knew Elliot had left a note. He knew those words had reached him like nothing else ever had. But what psalm was it? That unfinished verse had to come from somewhere, and now he needed to know where. He needed to understand. He wanted to go to the root of what had healed his soul, even before it began healing his body. During shift change, he called Megan over with a subtle gesture. "Those papers from the previous patient, do they still exist?" She looked puzzled. "You mean his belongings? Anything? A Bible, notes? Maybe that's where the missing piece is." Megan promised to check, and she did. A few hours later, she returned with a box. Inside it was an old Bible, the cover worn and the edges filled with marks. In the corner of the inside cover, something had been written in blue ink, now nearly faded. Megan showed him gently. Brian took the Bible with slightly trembling hands. He opened it. Dozens of verses were marked, but only one page had been folded twice, as if to hide a secret. When he unfolded it, the verse was there, clearly underlined, in ink, fresher than the rest. Brian read it silently, his lips moving along with the words. And then he whispered, as if recognizing the voice of someone he once loved, "For you are my hope, O Lord God. You are my trust from my youth." It was Psalm 71. He kept reading. Every word felt like it had been written for him and by him. It was as if Elliot had chosen that psalm not just as a prayer, but as a spiritual inheritance. A legacy not meant to comfort, but to awaken. And every line confirmed. "Do not cast me off in the time of old age. Do not forsake me when my strength fails." Brian closed his eyes, cried. It wasn't grief anymore. It was reverence. It was like God had whispered in a father's voice, "I never left you." He went back to the original note, the first one, the one that read, "If I'm not here tomorrow, know this, God still will be." And now, it all made sense. Elliot had left a map, a psalm, an invitation to return. That night, Brian did something he hadn't done since Lillian's death. He sat in the chair beside his bed, opened the Bible to Psalm 71, and read out loud. "In you, O Lord, I put my trust. Let me never be put to shame. Deliver me in your righteousness and cause me to escape." His voice was weak, but steady. And as he read, it was as if each verse opened a window inside him, a window that had been closed since the day he buried the love of his life. When he finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, then said something that sounded like a vow. "If this word lifted me up, then I'll use it to lift others, too." And that's what he did. He folded the Bible page, placed his new letter inside it, and left both at the bottom of the drawer. He knew another patient would soon occupy that room, and he wanted the next person to find something. An echo, a spark, a memory of faith planted even before they arrived. The next day, the doctors confirmed Brian was fit to continue treatment at home. The test results showed something they described as an unusual recovery. But Brian knew the real name, a reunion with faith, with hope, with prayer, with life. And before leaving the hospital, Brian looked one last time at the window. The phrase etched into the glass was still there. Now he knew what it meant. And now, he also knew the psalm that had been left for him, and that from that day forward, he would leave for someone else. Brian left the hospital without fanfare, without long goodbyes, without flowers, just a bag of clean clothes and that Bible folded close to his chest. He didn't take any machines or visual reminders of that room, but he carried something the eyes couldn't see, something with weight, something still alive. It was the memory of an encounter, not with a person, but with a purpose. Because what happened in room 312 wasn't coincidence, it was continuity. It was like someone had lit a candle, and another hand, somewhere in the future, had been chosen to keep it burning. 2 weeks later, already home, Brian began doing something he never imagined before. Every morning he opened his Bible to Psalm 71 and wrote anonymous letters using adapted verses. In each envelope, a sentence of faith. In each sentence, a living promise. Then, he would go out for a walk. He left the notes on park benches, in mailboxes, in clinic waiting rooms. He didn't sign them. He didn't explain. He just wrote, for whoever needs to be reminded that there is still hope. His daughter, Autumn, once asked, "Dad, why do you do this?" He replied with a gentle smile, "Because someone did it for me, without even knowing I existed." And it was true. In his bedroom, on top of his desk, Brian placed Elliot's phrase in a simple frame. If I'm not here tomorrow, know this: God still will be. That was now the phrase at the entrance of their home, not as decoration, but as testimony. That faith continues. In Wing 3B of the hospital, Room 312 had already been given to another patient, a young man named Marcus, only 27 years old. Diagnosed with a severe autoimmune condition, he was facing the first days of his hospital stay filled with fear and anger. When he opened the drawer beside his bed, he found the Bible, and tucked within its pages, 2 folded papers. One in old handwriting, the other more recent. He read them in silence. And when Megan entered to check his vitals, she found Marcus crying, eyes locked onto the page. He didn't say a word, but in that moment, the prayer had started again. That's the power of spiritual legacy. It doesn't need microphones or a stage. It happens when someone writes, even without knowing who will read it. When a prayer ends with a comma, waiting for another soul to continue the sentence. When an ordinary room becomes a sacred space. When faith is not just a memory, but a seed, and now it's in your hands. If you've made it this far, it's no accident. God wants to use your story to reach others. Maybe you're the one who's been praying, or maybe the one who hasn't found the strength to believe again. But wherever you are, there's a place for your voice in this living chain. Right now, write in the comments the name of someone you love, someone who is sick, someone in need of a new beginning. It could be your own name, or the name of someone who has already passed, but left behind a living faith. Let's make this space more than a video. Let's turn it into a digital altar. Every name written here will be read with love. Every story shared will become a prayer in motion. And if something deep moved your heart today, hit the like button. That simple act could be the first step of healing for someone who hasn't found this video yet. Now, take a deep breath. Place your hand over your chest, or think of the person you want to surrender to God, and repeat this prayer with me, based on Psalm 71. Lord, you have been my hope since my earliest days. Even when pain screamed, you didn't go silent. When my strength failed, you remained. Today I come back to take shelter in you. Don't reject me when I'm weak. Don't abandon me when my body gives out. Restore what was lost, sustain what still beats, and write, Lord, a new chapter over the ruins that remain, because my trust has always been in you. If you prayed with me, write in the comments. My story is still being written by God, and if you want this prayer to reach others, share this video with someone who needs hope, because sometimes all heaven needs to begin a miracle is a simple psalm.